Hey, good morning and good afternoon to everyone that's joined us for our second episode of our cyber attack for payroll, really, or surviving a payroll cyber attack. It's such a topical conversation, I think, and from the feedback from our first episode, we received really good response, and I think it really is a hot topic. So firstly, we'd like to know where you all have joined us from. And secondly, if you have any questions for Mike and Tristan, please feel free to put the questions in the comment box. We like it to be really interactive as well if we can. So if you see me typing away, because of the way that the software is, I have to speak to you via my phone. So I'm not being distracted, but the guys can see your comments. So please make sure that you do write your comments in the box. And if you're watching it post live, still feel free to add your comments because we do check on them and then we can come back to you. So welcome. As I said, we've got a second episode of Surviving a Cyber Attack, Picking Up the Pieces, which is part 2 of a 3-part series. The third episode will be next week, so we'll give you a few more details on that. So cybersecurity in the payroll industry, how to manage a crisis, the aftermath, and how to prevent it in the first place. Obviously, it's a pragmatic guide for payroll leaders. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Melanie Pitsey, and I am the CEO of the Global Payroll Association. You can find more information about us on globalpayrollassociation.com. Those of you that are members, or those of you that aren't members, you'll know that our members get an expansive range of interactive training courses, access to comprehensive directories, in-depth country-by-country resources. Basically, we're a one-stop shop for all payroll professionals. And if you are a member, we have a member WhatsApp group where we share a lot of information. And again, one of the reasons this has come up because people were asking what should they do because their particular payroll provider had actually been hacked and they were a bit lost and didn't know where to start. So because of that, really, the conversation started with Mike and Tristan. And then we have seen quite a lot, haven't we, of the cyber attacks, unfortunately. And I think really it's the future, not a good part of the future, but I think it's a part of the future that we all need to be aware of. And what do we do, and what path or part does payroll play in this crisis? We've also written recent articles. Mike's written an article on this as well. So at some point during the session, I'll add this to the comments so that you can see this. I'll also add in the comments the episode 1, just in case you do want to see that as well. So for this 3-episode LinkedIn series, we'll bring together everyone from the payroll industry, all our experts, and we'll look at how we navigate through this complex landscape. So as I said during this episode, please ask us questions. We love it when it's interactive. And as you'll see, we have our experts with us. So obviously I'm not the expert, we do have our experts here. So we have Tristan Woods, a leader in global workforce and payroll management at Safeguard Global, and Mike Beff, a former Bloomberg BNA, I don't know why I'm having problems, Mike, sorry, managing editor. And they've both spent decades in the payroll industry. And as I said, Mike's written an article. Mike, do you want to just introduce yourself and say hi to everyone before we start?
Tristan, go ahead.
Yeah, sure thing. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Tristan Woods here from Safeguard Global. Mel, thanks for having us back. Great pleasure to be here with you and Mike again, hopefully imparting a bit of knowledge and helpful, useful tidbits for the community. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, and as Mel said, I'm Mike Bear, and what I'm currently doing is helping companies and organizations navigate kind of the payroll market and payroll issues so that they can understand and apply their programs and their narratives to the payroll audience appropriately. So I've been working with that. I've been an observer of payroll for many, many years. And this issue is near and dear to my heart, really. I first started writing about it about 8 years ago.
Thanks, Mike. And thanks, Sarah, for being the first person to add in the comments where you're from. So thank you for starting that off. As I said, love to hear from where everyone is. As I said, in the first episode, we discussed the variable threats of data breaches, how they can be different from other business disruptions that payroll is involved in, and why involvement in incident response plans, vendor protocols is becoming the part of payroll's ever critical role in an organization. It's just another part, isn't it, of how important payroll is. From this program, Tristan and Mike will discuss with me some of the approaches used to either keep payroll operations going or get them up and running again, communication surrounding mitigation efforts, and assessing the recovery as systems are brought back online. I mean, that's just key, isn't it, really? You know, what do we do? So my first question really, this is to you, Mike. Where can we begin to get a handle on what needs to be done to maintain the integrity of a payroll once a breach or attack has occurred?
Well, and that there's the big question is like, how do we go about addressing a hack or a breach? I mean, this is absolutely fundamental because, you know, to respond to an incident, and really any incident for that matter, can be more telling about an organization and impactful on employees than the incident itself. So a lot is at stake here, and I really can't overemphasize this, Melanie, in this realm is this response issue. And with that, I think it's important to kind of take a step back and first look at the resources that have been made available already to identify the type and the scope of an incident. The last episode, we provided a general outline of cybersecurity incidents by severity. So to start using that outline and your employer's incident response plan, or they might call it a data breach response plan, if you will, payroll professionals should either know or find out the impact on their operation and where in the process the problem is to be found. So for impact on payroll operations, that's kind of the next step, and it might be actually understood immediately. How serious is the issue? Is the payroll going to go out at all? Did payroll go out but was possibly corrupted by the incident? There are a numerous variety of scenarios here. The bottom line, though, the main question to the answer will be, will payroll need to pivot to other systems to get payroll out, either this cycle or next? And what tends to happen from my observation of payroll breaches over the years is, yes, some pivoting will be needed to continue paying your workers. Then after that, you need to look at where the problem is in the process. If the incident is so serious that payroll operations must be halted, which system piece needs to get that workaround? Knowing which parts are unaffected can be equally important. So, for example, I mentioned this in the last episode. In December 2021, there was a ransomware attack in the US halting the timekeeping application provided by a major vendor. Employers using that program were scrambling to come up with a backup solution so employee time worked could be determined to calculate gross pay. But the pay could still be processed and go out. What was missing was that first critical piece, the time worked application. But the tax withholding and other deduction parts, they were unaffected. Payment delivery systems themselves also were not impacted. And now I've heard of other breaches, and I'm sure you are well aware of them, and the tax that deal with diverting of payments. And that's just on the payment end, on kind of like the back end part, while the other parts of the process, like timekeeping, were left alone. So what you really need to focus in on is, A, how serious the problem is, and B, where in the payroll process this incident is impacting. And it can come from all angles. Tristan?
Yeah, I think that let's take that down to sort of deeper level. I think some really good input there and scenarios that we've all heard about. But I think what's important, I think, was one of the takeaways from this session is the kind of advanced scenario planning that people can do. So, for example, do you have contingencies in place to be able to get to all of that zero to gross pay data? Do you have a process in place that says, okay, we have the ability to estimate, for example, hours worked, or to estimate, salaries and so on, if that's necessary? And do you have access to that data? So in the event of, a ransomware attack, for example, with an assumption that most of your data is now inaccessible, your vendor systems that might be your time collection or other things, they are likely to be accessible. But what I think is important for people to consider is, do you have those scenarios and almost that policy in place that says, okay, if this terrible thing happens, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. And that helps payroll departments to be a lot more prepared for, okay, at least we have, for example, a set of rules around what we're going to do. So if this happens, we're going to do that kind of scenarios played out. And that enables you to then put in place mechanisms and process around, if we lose access to timekeeping, we're going to, our MO is going to be estimate previous hours. Have you got previous hours? Have you got an average of the last 12 weeks worth of hours? So you can get that pay as close to accurate as it can be. And that also enables then those conversations with HR and other leadership to be involved, to say, look, we're going to be doing our scenario planning on a sort of doomsday scenario. Does everybody buy into what our policy as a business is going to be? And that then can help feed other things that will be part of, crisis management that we talked about last time, for example, comms templates and some of those things. And again, that scenario planning, you can tie that back to some of your incident severity that we touched on last time as well. So thinking through those different things that can happen, and anybody familiar with the book, the Phoenix Project, which is a pretty sort of infamous book that starts with a payroll system failure, will be familiar with the knock-on effect that then starts to happen through that. And apologies if you're not familiar with that book.
Yeah, we're actually producing a podcast on that particular issue. So if guys, if you don't know about the Phoenix Project, it's definitely one to have a look at. You can just Google, and there's a lot of articles about it. And it's where a payroll provider was implemented, things, budgets cut, projects cut, employees cut. And those of you that are in payroll, you can, I'm sure, understand the impact that would have had on a very large payroll. I was looking at one of the audits on there, and there was just under 400,000 issues on people's pay that needed to be sorted out, and that was a good few years ago. And I know the issues are still happening, and also that those sorts of things are happening all the time. Just recently, there's an article on GPA Live where Swindon Council, so that's a small council in comparison to the Phoenix Project, and they suffered similar issues, budget cuts, procurement cuts, implementation cuts, and then there's failures with actually processing people's payrolls. So it's something that I know, Mike, we've spoken about it before, and you've come across those sorts of situations, haven't you, over the years? Just one of many stories.
Absolutely. And I mean, the thing is that it happens and it keeps happening. And that's why we need to have a really good plan for how to respond.
Yeah. So is there a method or a process to help payroll professionals get a handle on what is going on and where and when they need to step into the incident response process? Mike?
I could be really glib and say no, but there should be. No, I think a general approach, and we've discussed this before this event here, would include developing a checklist of sorts that lists all the critical parts of the payroll process. So you need to start with identifying the general parts of that payroll process. So if you look at the slide here that Mel was presenting, for example, we talked about time worked, time off, collection, where and how that data is collected, stored, and used. It may be through a third party. So when we look at time collection, there's a bunch of pieces beyond that. So when I'm presenting, what we're presenting to you here is just a very basic kind of checklist, but you should develop your own checklist based on kind of assessments of the payroll process and workflows of the data. This is not new to payroll to do those to do those things. Payroll professionals, if you've done that, it's sometimes called process mapping. So you already have a list of the major areas and can check off the ones that are impacted by a particular incident and the ones that are not. So that helps you narrow down, just what piece of the payroll process is going to be most impacted. So many breaches, data leaks, spills, or data mining operations that do not affect payroll systems per se, but nevertheless need to be mitigated. Sometimes the source of that breach is a payroll-related program. So payroll definitely should step in to help resolve and plug any holes that may be creating an issue that is more widespread within the organization. So some things in this checklist will be checked because they are impacted. And if not, but it involves employees, look for some direction from the response team in your organization. So we've had some other kind of data files, maybe some HR files that got hacked or something like that. But it doesn't involve any of these payroll process parts on this list that you've developed. Then you need to look for direction from the response team in your organization because it does affect employees, and you should also know how the response is going to be in terms of remediating that. So either way, there may be involvement in appropriately communicating to employees the issues and what is happening going forward. And we talked about that with the template in our first episode. Payroll should ensure any payroll or payment-related communications are accurate and appropriate before they go out. As in some cases, the writers of these communications, they may know little about the payroll processes. So it would behoove them to contact you all in payroll and vice versa to say, hey, can I take a look at some of this communication that you're writing, because it may, I want to make sure that it's accurate and true.
Yeah. No, that's it. I think the having the checklist is a really basic. Everybody in payroll is very familiar with checklists, and we all love a checklist. But I think it's a really useful artifact to have. And I think it's important as well just to mention to continue to update it, because obviously in our industry especially, things are moving very quickly and things can change. There's you might have a new integration with your HR system being implemented or changed that may or may not have an impact. So it's just worth having almost like a monthly reminder process to go and just look at that checklist. Are we still up to date? Because there's nothing worse than going, I know what I'm going to do in the event of a problem, but then you can't get to it because you've got an out of date checklist and you forgot one thing, or you didn't investigate one thing, and now we're in the moment and we don't know how to go and deal with that particular problem.
So, and just to let you guys know, I've had somebody ask for episode 1, so I've added that into the comment box. If there's any issues, can you just DM me or email me and I'll resend it? But hopefully, fingers crossed, that should work. So let's talk about getting the operations up and running again, or keeping them running. Tristan, what are the ways you suggest payroll teams approach a data breach that either halts or temporarily disrupts payroll operations? What can people do to get the payroll out? I mean, this is a key question, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I think this may or may not sound like super helpful, but I think the most important thing comes back to something Mike mentioned earlier on, is to do that process mapping. So if you're not in the middle of one of those events while you're on this webinar now, then time well used, towards the end of this week when you have some capacity, is to just start thinking through that process, to be mapping out the different systems that you have. What are your different systems of record, for example, for collecting hours or collecting overtime, or things that are pertinent and relevant to your organization, and be able to sort of map that out, understand where you've got integrations that could potentially get broken. Again, we touched on some of this last time, but if you've got dependencies on third-party external vendors and something happens to some of those systems, then how do you make sure you've still got some of that raw data? So start with that process mapping. Where is our data actually living? What are our different islands of that information? And then what would you do in an event? So do you have, for example, backup copies of some of those things? Are you routinely taking, for example, payroll registers that would include things like hours breakdowns and overtime, if that's relevant to you? And are you storing that in an appropriate place that's away from your sort of core network? So on a different segment, have you got alignment and agreement with the business to even store copies of that in, more unusual places? Because once you've gone through that process of thinking through, okay, I can get this data from here, I can get this data from here, and having an offline, up-to-date, fresh copy of that information every month, that will really help. Because then, if you don't have the access to data, you might say to yourselves, okay, we're going to run an average pay over the last 3 months and we're going to pay it. Well, what if you don't have access to the last 3 months pay registers? How do you do that calculation? So those are the types of things that we would encourage people to do, is think through where the data is. Do I have copies of it that are available? And then have I got policy alignment with different teams internally around what we're going to do in the event of an incident? And do I have an agreement with people like treasury teams and banks even to say, look, if I have to simply send you an Excel file, can you make payments quickly enough? Because all of these different parts of the process have so many different dependencies on other systems and potentially other vendors and on other teams, that I think it's really important to map that out, align on what you think you would do in those scenarios, and then make sure you've got access to that information, so that if it's a ransomware attack, that's probably the most common that's occurring at the moment. And the problem again is all your data is encrypted. You can't get access to it. Well, if you have a different segment of your internal network, can you put data there, have it in multiple places, so that you have at least the ability to get hold of what you need? And then your policy and your incident management can help with what you're going to actually do in that scenario. And Mike, I don't know whether you've got any additional thoughts on that.
Of course I do, but I echo everything you said, Tristan. I'm, just taking a step back. I'm amazed at what payroll people have done in the past to keep the payments flowing to employees. But a lot has been really seat of the pants resourcefulness that has been relied on primarily to overcome a breach of magnitude. Let's put it that way. So the most effective way to get operations going again, like you mentioned, Tristan, is to have those contingencies and backup plans that are secure, that they can be relied on to be picked up at a moment's notice to make the system whole again. And you touched on this, Tristan, the mapping that you touched on. We talked about the process mapping, but then there's data mapping too, which is really different from laying out the payroll process and mapping that out. Of course, payroll should have a good idea of where the data they have running through the system is and what it consists of, and whether any backup to those files or programs exist that can be securely used should an incident occur. So that is kind of like a big piece. And then also just kind of a little note there. Make sure you're not obviously naming these files something that, if there is a hack in your systems, that it's not so easy for the person who's trolling around in your systems to find these files. So there needs to be some sort of naming convention developed, I think, to kind of keep these files, just between the people that absolutely need to know, so that if there is a hack or a cybersecurity incident that impacts those files, you'll still be able to identify, and hopefully they won't have been compromised. Now, that ransomware on the third-party timekeeping system at the end of 2021, well, many clients didn't have a secondary method to capture time work data, and they kind of learned the hard way that something must be available to use. And I understand that some even went to the laborious paper method of time submission to try to fill the gap. Now, if it's a diversion of payments issue, which is not uncommon, unfortunately, the payment program is corrupted. And how can you trust the program again until you are assured it has been cleaned up, which could take a long time? Alternative payment arrangements that are secure and separate really need to be quickly set up. And that point can't be hit. I mean, was hit home recently. It wasn't a data breach issue in the US not too long ago, but a bank failure that forced at least one third-party payroll provider to scramble and find alternative funding for client payrolls. Individual employers are now really aware of how important an alternative funding arrangement is in this environment. And cybercriminal activity can trigger similar conditions as the bank failure that occurred earlier this year.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you can see Marta's question. Do you want me to put that up on screen? You happy to answer that?
I can see.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great question from Jimmy. Asked a similar question as well. So let's answer that, and then we can just come into some of the, the sort of what do you do after this has happened. So I think the best practices, Marta and Jimmy, to sort of answer your question would really be around like what they call red team testing. So this is as close to a live scenario test as you can do. This would rely on making sure everybody at least has a reasonable idea as to what you're going to do. And what you might choose to do as a payroll leader is to obtain, you kind of want to, if you want to really test this properly and put people through their paces and put the process through their paces, you probably want to minimize the amount of people that know about it. It's a little bit like, doing really detailed penetration testing. You don't want your team knowing it's happening, because otherwise they know what to do to mitigate it as you go. And it doesn't help you understand whether the test is valuable. But red team testing ultimately would be where you have your processes and your system and your plan outlined. You call a scenario where you say, okay, here is what's happened. We can't deal with X, and what are we going to do? We're going to follow our process. And the objective should be really to identify where there's gaps in the documentation, in your sort of continuous or incident response plan process itself. Now, a lot of companies' own security teams will run these types of exercises. So there's quite a good opportunity for payroll to collaborate with that team to say, look, how do we get involved in this with you? There's, of course, external vendors that can offer you these types of services as well. And the measurement would be, could you actually do the outcome that you're intending to do? So if you said, look, every system is completely unavailable and I've got to pay people in 2 days' time, outcome is, could you effectively do that, and what would be involved? And that would enable you to, as I say, see where the problems are in the process and to really sort of test it out. That would be like kind of what the best practice looks like. And then you would very quickly run a retrospective afterwards to see, okay, where did we see what was good about it, what wasn't good, what are the real critical areas that we need to focus on? Mike, you've probably got a lot of experience in that as well, so feel free to add.
Well, I not like you, Tristan, and that's why I think your points are right spot on. I'm the observer here, so you've been involved in more on the ground floor, kind of grassroots issues, dealing with creating these programs and then stress testing them. And I think your points are super valid. I think one of the things is that you really know you're successful when an incident has occurred and all those pieces kind of are managed appropriately, so that incident is handled as elegantly as possible, if you can call it that. But those kind of testing, absolutely, Marta, is super important to ensure that a response is appropriate, and that you're not kind of running around like a chicken with his head cut off, trying to figure out what to do.
Yeah.
I have to apologise. I missed one of the most important questions, really, about communication. Mike, you have communications background, and obviously you know how critical it can be to craft the right announcement properly, so employees get a proper understanding of the impact of the breach or the attack on them? What are some of the communication aspects being considered by a response team? Because I think this was one of the key questions from our members. What do we say? Just as basic as that.
Yeah, and it's it really is part and parcel of that response plan. But one of the unfortunate things is, Mel, is the range of communication approaches kind of track along with the range of data breaches and cyber attacks and their level of severity. So, there's a broad range of an appropriate response communications wise to the different types of breaches and cyber attacks, and also depending upon how critical it is to the operation. So, as outlined in an incident response plan, all incidents are going to have a comms role, but some are going to be very limited. So, for example, if it's a mobile phone being stolen or lost, for example, secure mobile phone, I'm hoping, or if somebody mistakenly downloaded a program that they shouldn't have, but it was discovered early enough to not have any major impact, that communication may be just really between those parties within the organization that were involved in either mitigating that or maybe unfortunately caused it. And that's pretty much it. But a larger data spill or data breach likely will need a broader communication to at least the internal teams affected. So kind of on a second level of severity, when that severity and the broadness of the particular issue is understood. In some cases, the entire staff should know. And then that would be internal communication only. Those types of communications, nevertheless, really still need to be vetted by the legal team, by HR, and others within the organization. And again, if it involves payroll at all, you should probably have a look over that copy to make sure something doesn't go out that is not that really is not accurate. Now, for grave and critical incidents, that public relations team, along with legal counsel, is going to probably take the lead in crafting a release. As we discussed in the first episode, this is done on an as-needed basis. And, as Tristan mentioned, we talked about a template for communication. If that release involves an incident that is payroll related, then payroll staff, I feel, should still be involved in that development of that messaging. So this is one place where you need, as a payroll professional, kind of make sure that, if it's payroll related, payroll involves a payroll process in some manner or form, that you have a piece of that. You actually should own a little bit of that communication piece, just to be sure that it's all appropriately mentioned, because people can go off track when they talk about payroll issues because they don't understand it that well.
Yeah. No, and I think, again, without sort of beating the drum too much, it comes down to some of that sort of upfront exercises that you can do with your HR colleagues, payroll, you as a team. If payroll can go and start that conversation with marketing, with your PR teams, with whoever is responsible for that sort of public, presentation of information, those are the teams to go and work with. And the payroll community should be the ones starting it, because then you get to be in a bit more control over kind of what's said, and you can start to template out some of those things. As you mentioned earlier, Mike, some of them can be very basic, follow the incident classification, the severity matrix, and say, okay, if this small thing occurs, who do we communicate to? What do we communicate? Whereas something that's very public, that's very big, clearly in those scenarios, you want to be saying probably as little as possible. But this is where PR people and marketing people are really helpful, because they'll help craft the right sort of message. And also, sadly, in today's times, you should work on the assumption that anything you need to send out to a group of people or your entire population internally, as we always see in the press, we obtained a copy of this internal email that circulated amongst Twitter, those types of scenarios, other social networks. Assume that it's going to get into people who people are going to inevitably be angry, and they might forget about their own confidentiality agreements and share that in other places. But again, it's all about getting some of this done up front. The last thing anybody wants to be doing is trying to figure these things out on the fly whilst they're managing an issue, that's actually live and active.
I think some of the issues that are, and I don't think there's an answer to this. Some of the issues that the members were having were that they were being told a certain response by a provider, and then finding out 6 weeks later that response wasn't correct. And obviously payroll people are very conscientious. Well, people generally are conscientious, aren't they, at work? But payroll people more so. And I think that the members that I know and friends within the payroll community have found that particularly hard to deal with. That, I suppose, lack of trust in the end, isn't there?
Well, look, I think there's all sorts of reasons for that, but it's very difficult. Something happens at 9 o'clock in the morning. People are expecting some sort of communication by 9 o'clock in the evening. You have an awful lot of unknowns at that point. There's a ton of things that you don't know. There's a ton of things that you think have happened that further forensic investigation will then tell you is the opposite of what you thought it was. And that's why, again, when you kind of go through media training and these types of things, it's all about communicating generally as little as possible. But I think it's just a difficult scenario with the pace of the world in general. But when these types of things occur, in reality, people won't know a whole lot. And that's probably why, as you mentioned, some of the community have said, look, they felt, that they got a different message 3 weeks later. Well, they probably did, because there was a ton more information available 3 weeks later. And I'm not quite sure what the answer necessarily is to that. Apart from thinking about these types of scenarios and, what you're going to say up front. And that's where the testing comes in, and the 7 Ps of the CIA, which I can't fully repeat, but it was something along the lines of proper prior planning prevents poor performance or something. Yeah.
I think
it's important.
But I think you're right. I don't think there is necessarily an answer, but then preparation is key, isn't it? I suppose, rather than have that panic of, if you have some guidelines, some preparation, that you have some confidence if you're in an unfortunate situation where this has happened, isn't it? So,
and it's been my experience. I've witnessed, kind of these knee-jerk reactions to things that have happened at the C level and at other levels where folks would put something out just because they feel compelled they need to say something about it. And that is a wrong way to do it. You really need to take a step back before you put out any kind of communication on these issues, and measure, kind of like Tristan said, what do you know so far about it? What really should be communicated at this point in time? And sometimes it might be just, hey, there's been an incident and it's affecting these parts. We're still investigating. Something like that it might even be better than either that or not saying anything until you've figured out more of the extent of the incident's impact on your operations. You've got those kind of two things, but unfortunately, our kind of people have these kind of gut reactions. They have to get something out right away to get ahead of the talk track or to try to set the narrative, and that can be the wrong road to travel.
And I think
these incidences.
And I think what Tristan said, it's a different world now, isn't it? When we were younger, Tristan, I think we're all in the same age group. We didn't have social media, did we? So you can put a communication out and it's a whole different world. It's more frightening, isn't it? Because things can get out into the media so much quicker now.
Yeah.
But I think also education, I think people need to understand that when there's a cybersecurity incident, that, it's different than a flood or a disaster or a fire or something like that, where you can fairly quickly measure the impact that those disasters and those incidences have had on the operation, and that it's ended. Unfortunately, with these, and it really, we need to tell the whole world that these cybersecurity incidents, they sometimes are still going on when these first communications come out. And they're still measuring the impact, and they're still figuring out how broad the scale is of that particular incident. That's a huge problem. But I think what we have to communicate when we're doing comms is, hey, this is the best we could do right now because we don't have a final answer for you.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's the next part? So once you've got the systems up and running, after a data security incident, what's next, Tristan?
I mean, I think one of the first things that won't necessarily feel like it's super important or priority, but is to try and get through some of that retrospective as quickly as possible. So you'll be managing still probably to be part of the plan. So you'll have regular cadence of checking in with actions that have arisen and things that need to be done. But I'd fairly quickly try and capture what have you learned through the process. So that retrospective, lessons learned, call it what you will, is to sit down and do that. And then I think a lot of it's going to be, from a payroll perspective, is going to be coming down to how do you reconcile and make good the next payroll. So a lot of what happens is we're going to pay estimates, we're going to pay last month, all of that, which then prompts an awful lot of unraveling of that process for the payroll teams, reconciling, actuals against or what was actually paid against what, should have been paid. And so that's, difficult because it's a load of work. It's often, heavily sort of spreadsheet based and those types of things. And again, sometimes, third party vendors will be able to help with that process. But I think the main thing is that you'll get through it is to look at, right, now we've had this, what do we do differently for the next time? Is there particular investments that we need to raise to generate business cases to buy in particular technology? We'll cover some of that on our next session, I think, or services that we want to be buying. But is capturing the moment as much as possible, what you're learning, because that's going to be the things that you're going to need to use next time round. And then share the best practices, right? So the GPA provides a great forum for that. But if there's something that you felt, you had a scenario, but it was well planned in advance, everybody remained calm and you got through it, well, then what did you do? And how much of that can you share with your peers? Because the more of this type of work that people can do that makes it, obvious to the sort of darker side of the internet that payroll teams aren't going to be flustered and messed around with, then it reduces the potential for being a target as well.
Mike.
Yeah, and I have to say that what Tristan said, I totally agree, first of all. But the other piece here with that, you mentioned third party providers or vendors involvement, and what I'm seeing here in my observation of the industry as it's been developing, and the automation and technological programs that have been implemented to really help payroll move forward, is the relationship between the client or the employer and that third party. And that it's really more of a collaborative type of an approach. It's more of a partnership relationship now. And I think both the vendors and the employers that are using those vendors are seeing the benefit of coming together to, and in this case for cybersecurity issues, to help resolve business problems. So what I just wanted to mention that this is a good development in that third parties are a great resource to help your organization deal with these issues. Now, once this thing is over, I guess, in the payroll, you need to determine when can you start breathing that air of relief, so to speak. Is it really over? Are we confident, again, our systems and the programs that we use, or is there more to do? Are the holes plugged? The back doors, is the intruder out? Okay. The back doors are shut and secure. With all that, I think payroll has to express enough confidence in the remediation process so employees can trust that they will be paid accurately and on time again. There's a lot to overcome there. because once you have a problem like this, people start to question the system itself. And it takes time to get that trust back. Our systems, and I agree with Tristan that the lessons learned, a retrospective session on how the recovery went, that needs to happen soon after stability is reached.
Okay, so I'm just conscious of time. We've got a few key takeaways. Tristan, Mike, would you like to reiterate?
Yeah, sure. Again, map out your parts of the process. So look at this from a systems perspective, a data perspective. Think about, what are you going to do in the scenario that one of those systems or that data is not available, and have, that inform a lot of your plan, again, using the sort of severity matrix as well. Again, as we talked about a lot, communicating comms, right, as much of that for templating, or at least having that policy around what are we, intending to stay, what's our corporate position going to be, I think is key. And then again, conduct the lessons learned. Continuous review, continuous testing is absolutely paramount to mitigating these types of issues.
Thank you. Okay, so we have our third and final episode next week on the 26th of July at 3 p.m. Do you want to just let everyone know what they should expect? Mike?
Yeah, sure. I mean, generally what we've gone through now is kind of like an introduction and education to cybersecurity issues in general. And then with this latest episode that we're just completing now, we've talked about those issues, those other issues that happen, how we can expect to deal with responding to an incident. Well, now we want to talk about, okay, what are the needs of payroll to help mitigate potential issues? And what should you be checking up on now to mitigate the issues that are arising? So this session will contain kind of actionable insights that payroll leaders can use to hopefully sleep a little more soundly when you go to bed at night. Kind of the state of the landscape. We're going to be talking about involving people and the technical controls, how to manage those third parties, as I mentioned and Tristan mentioned. And really, Tristan's going to talk about 360-degree risk management. So that should close out this series.
Well, thanks so much. So I will put the link in on the comments. And again, please message me or follow myself, Mike, or Tristan, and you'll be able to see the link for next week's session. If you have any questions, as I said, please add it onto the comments section. If you want to know a little bit more about the GPA, please contact myself. We've got loads of events coming up from September onwards, so all educational, and we're going to do a little bit more as well on this cyber security. We'll be offering some more information and a toolkit over the next few weeks. So thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you again, Mike and Tristan, and I look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you.
Thank you.